This session is in relation to innovations in parasport systems, and we've got three fine presenters today. Andrea Bunden, Assistant Professor in Kinesiology at University of British Columbia, will speak first, followed by Laura Meisner from University of Western Ontario, and Jen Bruce, who is Senior Coordinator of Paralympic Pathways at the Canadian Paralympic Committee. So over to you, Andrea, to begin.
Thank you. Well, just thank you very much, especially Danielle and Tim, for inviting me here and for this opportunity to come and speak to all of you about some of the work that we're currently doing in British Columbia around disability inclusion in the sports sector. But also, I mean, I've enjoyed the entire day learning about the work that's being done here. And there's been some really interesting connections that I think I can make with what I'll be presenting today. What I'm going to talk about is some of the research that I've been involved in for the past 14 months as part of a research partnership between Via Sport British Columbia, and I'll explain a bit who they are, the School of Kinesiology at the University of British Columbia, and then also UBC Athletics and Rec Department. So first of all, I'll just explain who our partner on this project is. Via Sport British Columbia is the lead agency in the province responsible for promoting and developing amateur sport. They have as a mission or a mandate to champion positive change so that more British Columbians can thrive via sport and physical activity. Now, what makes them a bit unique and it's a different model than many of the other provinces, is that although they administer over 14 million annually of BC government sport investment, they are not a government organization. They are a nonprofit who's contracted to essentially administer this funds as well as other funds from different sources. So they provide the grants that support 54 PSOs and 7 DSOs in the province, as well as many grassroots sports organizations, parks and recreation boards, and they're involved in sport hosting and events as well. And they do this through different mechanisms. So like I said, they provide grants, they provide direct financial support to these organizations, but they're also highly involved in policy development, in coach development, in mentorship development, so all sorts of educational and other programs as well. And I'll say, when I say they champion positive change, they are very much of the mindset that they use the grants, they use the educations as opportunities to nudge or encourage organizations to what has been considered best practice. In 2015, Via Sport launched a campaign called Level the Field. And they described this as a province-wide movement to create a more inclusive sport culture in BC for underrepresented groups. Some of the groups that they intend to, or that they believe to be underrepresented in the current sports sector are women and girls, people with disabilities, newcomers to Canada, LGBTQ I2S communities, and Aboriginal peoples, although it's not limited to that list. And what's important to know about this Level the Field campaign is that while there are specific initiatives targeted at each of these communities, they are considering the campaign very, very broadly to address inclusion in the sports sector. So each area has sort of specific initiatives and strategies attached to it, but we are very much interested in intersectionality as well, and that's a topic that's come up in, I think, every single session today, that considering, for example, disability inclusion and isolation will only get us so far, and we have to look at how disability intersects with other identities. The other thing that's similar across all of the different parts of this initiative is that they really value partnership and collaborative approaches. So working with community members, working with grassroots organizations in each of these areas, and then also trying to foster connections across communities who might be able to learn from each other or support each other. So where do I come into this? Well, Just so happens that 2 of the directors at Via Sport completed their PhD with me at the University of British Columbia in kinesiology. And we started talking specifically around their disability inclusion portfolio as part of the Level the Field campaign. And in 2016, I guess, we applied for a grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. It's called a Partnership Development Grant. These are 3-year grants, or up to 3-year grants, and what's unique about them is that they provide funding for research, but they also provide funding to build partnerships. So they essentially buy you a bit of time to both do your research, but also to explore how you can work together as partners and look for other opportunities to collaborate or to sort of further build out this partnership. So we applied for this grant in 2016, received funding in 2017, and for the past 14 months have been working together. We have a research team that includes Via Sport staff members, 2 postdoctoral researchers, including Tim, somewhere in the room, recently hired on our project, and also several graduate students and undergraduate students are also involved at different points in the project. So what have we been up to? Well, the other thing I really like about the SSHRC partnership grants is, unlike some of SSHRC's more traditional research grants, they don't expect you to have a very, very clear research plan. They let you be a bit vague on the research details because they want to know the details of your partnership and how you intend to work together, how you intend to engage and collaborate. So they put more emphasis when adjudicating these grants on, have you actually thought out your governance? Have you thought out how you're going to work together? And what are you trying to achieve? And then they give you a bit more flexibility on figuring out the details of the actual research once you've actually had that opportunity to have conversations as partners. So we decided very early on that, we had some ideas for research. We knew what a few of our first steps were going to be, but we spent more time talking about what were our values and what were the things that we hoped to accomplish by working together. And we came up with this, I call it our aspirational statement. We sometimes call it a few different things, but it says, we, the partners on this project, are collectively and individually committed to, first, carrying out research that identifies sources of disableism that prevent people with disabilities from inclusion in the sports sector. Second, engaging in practices that promote more affirmative ways of thinking about disability. And third, creating a more inclusive sports sector locally and regionally. And as you can see, that third statement doesn't actually reference disability at all, and I think it shows our commitment to thinking about inclusion from a more broader perspective. And the way we use this statement is that when we arrive at a decision point, when we're having challenges working together, when we are at critical points in our project, we return to this statement and go, okay, we're having differences right now. We have different opinions of where we could go, but we still share these values, and we let these values really guide our decision making. However, we do ultimately have to get to the research part of this. So what have we been working on? Well, in the last 14 months, we've been mapping out, and now all projects are actually recently started, but we have 3 separate studies that, as a team, we're involved in. The first study asks, what are provincial sport organizations and disability sport organizations in BC currently doing to support disability inclusion? The second project looks at how can we connect with disability communities and how can we connect disability communities with each other. And then the third project looks at how can we connect individuals and organizations to existing programs and resources. And I'm going to give you just a couple minutes on each one of those studies and where we're at. So in study number 1, this is the PSO and DSO engagement. Like I said, PSOs and DSOs in BC currently receive their funding from Via Sport. They differ quite a bit in what chunk of their funding they receive from Via Sport. So some of them are largely dependent on Via Sport. Others, it's one source of funding for them. And every 4 years, they're evaluated by Viasport. I should say, the organizations are not evaluated by Viasport. Viasport evaluates their investment. They essentially engage all these organizations in a process where they evaluate what's been done and whether or not that investment has achieved its intended purpose. This has been ongoing since Viasport was established following the Vancouver Olympics, and the last review was a few years ago. So we're actually just preparing for the next investment review will happen this year. However, what definitely came out in the last review, which was the first time organizations were asked about anything related to disability inclusion, parasport programming, inclusive opportunities, was that not all organizations are the same. They don't have the same mandate when it comes to parasport. They don't have the same history of involvement in parasport. So is it really fair to evaluate them the same way? Should we be asking the same thing of every organization? So this is where our current team comes in. One of the things we've been working on in advance of this year's investment review is a typology. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm advancing on my screen, but not on yours. There you go. A typology of sport organizations, of PSOs and DSOs. And please be a little patient, because I know some of you will look up at this list and go, that's not right, or I don't like that terminology. We're refining this. This is a work in progress. But what we've come up with is these 5 categories of adaptive, supportive, shared, integrated, and multi-sport. So to give you some examples, the adaptive label is what we're using to describe sports where there is no parasport pathway, no formal parasport pathway. So these are sports that are not in the Olympic or Paralympic Games. They're sports that, as CPC will tell you, they're not part of, there's no set para pathway. So this would include in our province, for example, baseball, diving, figure skating, synchronized swimming. The question for these organizations is, okay, so you're not in the Paralympic Games. Does that mean you don't have to be inclusive? And, when faced with that question, most of them will say, well, no, we acknowledge that, participating in sport can be viewed as a human right. We have to be inclusive, but we don't know where to start because we're not recruiting or training individuals for the Paralympics. So, and I should say, some of them are actually doing a very, very good job. Synchro BC is doing some really interesting work around disability inclusion. But they're quite different than the other categories. Supportive organizations are those that do not actually engage in sport-specific activities. They don't, for example, deliver sport programming, but they have a huge role to play in advocacy, for example. And we heard on the last panel, Alberta Deaf Sports could fall into this category of having a huge role in supporting individuals to access sport and a huge role in advocating for the deaf community in sport spaces and sport programs, but they're not delivering a specific sport program. In the shared category, this is where there is a formal parasport pathway. It is included in the Paralympic Games. However, the sport is shared across different organizations. So one example, and this is, I think, slightly different in BC than Alberta, but we have both BC basketball and we have BC wheelchair basketball. 2 different organizations, both involved in basketball. Sometimes it's clear what falls into one category and what the other, but when it comes to something like developing coaches, they actually work together. So they're a shared responsibility there. Integrated sports are the ones that are where the Paralympic pathway is housed almost entirely within a single sport. So an example of this would be cross-country BC, curling BC, rowing BC. They might coordinate with another group occasionally, but they are largely entirely responsible for the parasport pathway. And then the final category is the multi-sport, where this one includes organizations that are usually organized around a particular disability group. So we have wheelchair sports. They are involved in, I think someone said, 5 sports. And they actually do deliver their own sport programming. And they do this both alone and working with others. Now, like I said, this is a work in progress. It will be refined. But the first step in refining it is we are now going to the PSOs and DSOs, and we are interviewing individuals who are working, volunteering, running programs in each of these organizations to ask them, first of all, what do you think your mandate is around delivering disability-inclusive sport programming? What are you currently doing? What are you currently doing? What do you think you could be doing? And how can we fund you to do more? And also, how should we then evaluate our investment? So I fully expect that some organizations are going to come back and say, first of all, this classification system needs to be refined, or we don't agree with where we've been placed within it. However, we've interviewed, I think, within 5 organizations, and we're also hearing this is really great to finally see laid out where we fit within this very complicated system, and to actually go, actually, we're not responsible for that, but we are responsible for this. And what it's already doing is stopping a bit of that passing the buck of going, yeah, we don't do that, that's not our problem, someone else delivers wheelchair racing, right? So just getting a lot more clarity around what people believe their mandates are and could be has been helpful already. This will inform the investment review that happens later this year. It's still early. It's not a matter, we're not looking to cut people's funding, we're just trying to figure out actually how we can get organizations to apply for the funding they actually need to do to carry out what they're actually responsible and capable of. So that's the first study. The second study, I think, speaks to something that's also been raised several times today, which is, disability often does happen in intersections with other social positions and social identities, and that as a sports sector, we might be reaching a very, very small number of people with disabilities. I also heard a few people say, well, we're not stealing an athlete from another sport, but this is a concern we've heard repeatedly, is that we're all competing for athletes with disabilities. We're trying to look at how can we actually broaden the reach of who's being engaged in sport. And in order to do this, we realized quite quickly we can't go through the PSOs and DSOs and our existing sport networks, because if they knew how to reach more individuals, they probably would have done it. So instead, we're working with disabled communities, disabled people's organizations, to go to their community members, their clients, their partners, to say, what would it take to get you involved in sport? And the end goal of this is to try to involve more people in sport rather than just create more opportunities for those already engaged. So to give you a bit of background on how we're doing this, we've started working with different community groups. I'll admit this one is in early stages because community engagement takes a long, long time. And it usually just starts with us having coffee and chatting about what we could do together. And we started on our own UBC campus. We're not calling it a pilot project per se, but we figured we should start our work at home. And the UBC campus, for those of you who don't know it, we have 60,000 students, but we also have about 20,000 people who live on campus, plus another 14,000 students. So the UBC campus is itself a small municipality. So to date, we've engaged with the Disabled Students Organization, we've engaged with the University Neighborhood Associations, we've been working with Access and Diversity, and we really go to them and say, listen, we're wondering if you have any needs that aren't being supported in the area of sport and physical activity, and could we talk to you guys about that? And as a result, every engagement has looked very, very different. The one I've got images for here, there's 3 images on the screen of an open house that we held at a community center on campus. So it's a community center operated by the University Neighborhood Association. It's available to everyone who, well, it's supposed to be available and accessible to everyone who lives, works, studies, or plays on campus. It's fairly recently opened, and they have themselves identified that, we don't have many people with disabilities coming through our doors, and yet we know there are people with disabilities on campus. So we held an open house. You've got one image there that's an aerial shot of sort of our different stations and community members going to different stations. The stations were organized so that one spoke to the built environment, one was for the social environment, and one was for the program environment, or the programming offered. The next image there is two of our research assistants at a station on the built environment. So people were given tours of the facility, and then there were sort of interactive boards where they could provide comments and feedback on the built environment. The third image is a station on the program environment, where people both commented on how existing programs could be made more inclusive, and then also suggested new programming ideas. Said that was the event with the UNA. Each event has been very, very different, and that's exactly what we want it to be. One of the interesting things, but one of the challenges here has been that, you know, people show up and sometimes they don't want to talk about what we want to talk about. So, you know, they come in, they're not really that interested in sport, but they want to know about what kind of cultural programming we could offer. Or they don't have a disability, but they're wondering what we have for older adults or for newcomers to Canada. We just go with it because we asked them what they were interested in, and that's what we heard. So we have to maintain a bit of flexibility, and that, you know, that sometimes poses challenges for us because we're funded to do disability inclusion. However, all of this can fit within that level the field umbrella. And the third project, which is the one that Tim is working on, is the Accessible Sport Hub. And this is the idea of trying to connect people with existing resources. So ASH is a chat bot that was developed by Viasport and Microsoft, and it's currently on their website if you're interested. And the idea is that you should be able to go and use this chat bot to find existing programs or resources. So if you're a person with a disability, you should be able to find an accessible sport program. If you're a coach who wants some information on coaching an athlete with a disability, you should be able to find that. However, ASH is only as good as the resources that are uploaded to it. And also, as Tim has found out, only as good as they're tagged and labeled. So the first step of this project has been to work with the organizations and clubs within the province. We know there are resources out there, to make sure that the resources they have spent a lot of effort in developing actually are uploaded, and that they're tagged correctly, and that they can be found with the right search parameters and stuff like that. The next step that we're just now embarking on is ASH uses, I think computer learning is the best word, but it's kind of like the Alexa or the Google or Siri, that the more you use it, and it learns how to better answer your questions. So currently, not many people are using ASH because it only works kind of well. We need to get more people using it. And at first we tried to send this out to PSOs and DSOs and said, you know, we need you to test ASH, and we realized that was the wrong group because they know the resources, they know exactly what they're looking for. They could either very easily find it, or they were calling us and saying, my resource hasn't been properly tagged, I need you to change it. But it didn't really tell us how, like, a parent of a child with a disability would use ASH. So here's Tim's great idea. Welcome to the bot camp. We're going to be running events throughout the month of June that will essentially train ASH. We're recruiting participants who will include sort of the end users, community members, parents, coaches, athletes, people who aren't athletes but think maybe they could be athletes, and we're going to ask them to submit their questions, their queries, and then to let us know how well ASH did in responding. And then we will use that to further refine and develop the programming language that ASH uses. And that's my last slide. So that's essentially what we've been up to. Maybe the things that I want to reinforce is that we're increasingly understanding not all organizations are in the same position to deliver disability-inclusive programming. That doesn't mean every organization can't be doing something. We need to be reaching more people, not just providing more opportunities for the same people. And we need to better connect people with the existing resources.
Thank you very much, Andrea. We are going to change over to Laura Meisner from the University of Western Ontario to talk about Parasport Ontario provision.
From Western University.
Sorry.
Rebranded. You should know that, David. Thank you. So, first of all, I should let you know that where the background I'm coming from is a bit different. I'm a sport management scholar, and so when I come at my talk today, I'm going to come at it from that perspective. Lots about systems and structures and that framework. So, what I was really asked to do was to talk about the ways in which we've developed a framework for collective action in the province of Ontario. I was really fortunate to be involved early on with this group, and the reason I got involved with the Ontario group was happenstance. I was involved in a grant that I was looking at legacy of major games around Parasport. And so in 2015, I went to CPC and said, this is something I'm working on, and as CPC does, jumped on board and pulled me right in and said, great, can you help us out? And so I've been involved with the Ontario Parasport for Collective basically since day one, since they've started their work around what they've done. So it's an interesting case study, and I think there's a lot of learnings that we can take away from that. And that's really what I'm going to talk about today is some of those learnings that we've come about along the way. So I'll talk specifically about the case in Ontario, how it came about, and some things that we've discovered from that, and really thinking about some of the areas around the guiding principles for the development of an aligned parasport system. I should say it's a process that's ongoing. We don't have all the answers, and certainly we still have a lot to figure out. On Wednesday, before I came here, I spent the day in Toronto with Jen, and we were working on the next steps for this group. So certainly it's something that is an ongoing process. But first of all, as a scholar, I need to tell you a little bit about the direction I'm going to come at this and talk about this. One of the things that I think that group, now that I've been working with them for about 5 years now, probably is sick of hearing me say, but I talk a lot to them about, I don't want to hear about barriers anymore. Let's talk about how we navigate that. How about we talk about the constraints within the system and how we're going to make those changes in order to navigate it. Because if we focus so much on the negative, so a deficit perspective, we'll never get anywhere. We need to move our change our frame of thinking towards our assets, what we have to offer and how we mobilize those assets, those strengths, to create a better and more aligned system. So I've really been pushing the group to think in new and different ways. I've also been really coming at that with my sport management background, asking them to think a lot about how do you want to operationalize your working environment? How do you want to operationalize the goals that you've set for each other and consider the context within which you function? So the policy environment is particularly important. So our last panel, when we started to talk about policy, the three of us got all excited. We love this stuff. So policy is something that we feel is very important to the way we think about how our systems are structured. And also really wanting to think about this forward thinking and some design thinking and being innovative. And being innovative doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a catastrophic change, but something new and different. That's the definition of innovation. So for an organization to think about something new and different. So those small changes are particularly important. So really coming at that from some different and interesting directions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this case study. So in Ontario, this group came together around a very specific goal. In 2015, as you well know, Toronto hosted the Para-Pan American Games. In advance of that, certainly the event itself as a mega event had numerous legacy objectives, so economic and social outcomes that they wanted to see happen. But there were some goals that they also set around thinking about how can we affect change, and that aligned really well with what's happening in the scholarly literature, where we're moving away from this notion of legacy, which is sort of those leftover pieces of hosting an event, to being more strategic about how we go after those opportunities. So that's where the notion of event leveraging has come about, which is really about the activities that need to be undertaken around an event in order to maximize the long-term benefits of the event. So it's not that there hasn't been groups that have come together around events before, but what we have found is that very few have sustained post-event. So this is a really interesting case for many reasons. And so what I'm going to show is a framework, and it's a bit of a complicated framework, so I'll explain it as best I can, but I think it's a really important one because it's how we addressed our research. And I'm not going to talk a lot about the methodology that we used. I had a number of graduate students working on the projects over a number of years, so I'm sort of synthesizing a large amount of information into a large framework. So the framework I'm showing here consists of a box as the exterior. The big piece of this is that box represents the system context. So in a system, there needs to be the players and the actors ready to participate. So is there an environment that people want to come together and collaborate? Because if the system is not ready and there isn't the policy context for it to happen, then chances are it's not going to be successful and it's likely to fail. Inside that box, we have what's known as the collaborative governance regime. At some point, there has to be some decisions made about how we function to work together. So if we're going to come together, we need some rules of engagement. And so those two things, we tend to be pretty good identifying those two large areas. Where it becomes more complicated is the smaller box within that collaborative governance framework, which is the dynamics of collaboration. So how organizations actually work together. And what we know from the management literature is that there needs to be specific drivers that bring organizations together to form these alliances and partnerships. And the three cogs that work together and are ongoing, so that's really important that I've said that this is an ongoing process, are principled engagement. So why partners come together, what is their purpose of being there, and why would they want to continue to be involved in that alliance? What capacity do they have to be able to work together? So the capacity for joint action is critical, which then feeds into that shared motivation. So partners may have come to the table first because they were self-motivated, but eventually they develop a shared motivation, which then is an ongoing process. So those three cogs are really important because they're constantly moving, and that partnership then is constantly evolving. That then can lead to our actions. So as we move towards the right, we look at that leading to specific actions developed by that group, and that will have an impact in the community or whatever that area is. So those are really important pieces. And so what we did early on is, in working with this group, is start to investigate some of those pieces within the framework of this collaborative action. So how do those organizations work together, and what makes sense for them? So in this case, it's quite interesting because certainly the games was the central driver. So there are lots of negative impacts about hosting a large-scale event, and I cite a lot of literature around why a city should not host an event, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. If you do host it, there are some things that we can do, and that's where the leveraging piece is really important. It's actually taking advantage of that opportunity. So in this case, the driver is the games themselves. So it's a catalyst to bring those groups together. In the province of Ontario, of course, there is the AODA Act, which is the Accessibility for Ontarians with a Disability, that needs to be in action in all public organizations by 2025. So that provides a sound system context and resources for those organizations to come together. So this was a central driver as well in why these organizations were able to come together and take action. And in this particular case, there were some people who worked hard on bringing the groups together. So you cannot simply say, and all organizational literature will tell us, you can't just have a group of people that come together and start to talk and it works. You need a leader or some organization to take some lead on this. And in this case, there was a shared leadership model put in case, CPC being a big driver on that early on so we could bring people together. But then all the organizations coming to the table really brought a shared approach to that leadership model. And so that's really important, and we could write a whole other piece on the leadership alone. And so for the collaboration dynamics, it's really important here to think about what this group wanted to achieve. And there are three things: goals, resources in the form of capital, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, and developing that legacy. Well, so what is that impact going to look like? So I'll tell you a little bit about what the results say. In this group, their actions were very municipal-based. So the municipalities were the ones who implemented specific plans around the games. But I'm not going to talk about that. That's a separate piece. I'm going to talk more about the collaborative action piece, so how they came together and some of the things that we've learned as a result of that. So the first piece is around the notion of the collaborative dynamics. So the principled engagement piece is probably the most critical in terms of finding out why different partners came to the table. So at the table, we have Parasport organizations, we have DSOs, we have provincial organizations that are not necessarily directly related to Parasport, but are getting involved. We now have Special Olympics involved as well. And each of those organizations came with an agenda, but our first point of contact with them is always to discover, what have you done, what are you doing, and why have you done, why are you here? And so that's been very deliberate piece that's been done throughout the process. And without that deliberate action, then we don't understand or know what the principles are for which they're engaging in this process. And without that, what we've seen is those who don't have the principles that align well with what we're trying to achieve tend to disengage. And then, so those that have, it's been a process of trying to build that shared motivation. So what are we there for? And the easy thing leading up to the games was, well, everybody wanted to get something out of the games. We didn't want to let the process go by and us not do anything about thinking about the system in the province. When I first came to the meetings, the group said, we want to increase participation across the province for people with disabilities. And I said, what? Why? I mean, a great goal, but realistically, you're hosting a games in Toronto. Why would a games in Toronto have any impact on participation in Thunder Bay? So we need to be very mindful of that. So it took some time for us to get the group to think about what that motivation was, refine that motivation so that they had some internal legitimacy. Because the problem would be coming to the table and saying we're going to increase participation in Parasport across the province, yet doing nothing and no contact with organizations outside of the Greater Toronto Area. So that was very critical. And that then led to those organizations being able to make a commitment because they could see themselves having a stake in that outcome. And so that was a critical piece of it. Probably one of the biggest challenges that we faced throughout the process was that capacity for joint action. Because of course, all these organizations are pulled in different directions, and they all have scarce resources. And so making sure that they understood that even the small actions that they were taking within those organizations toward that shared goal was critical to the process. And that's something we're still working on, and probably a big ongoing piece. And Jen and I have conversations about this quite often, about how do we continue to bring them to the table to see how that collaboration can continue. So the key considerations that really come out of the research that we've done is that bringing those organizations to the table is the easy part. Getting them to stay and getting them to buy in and build trust is probably the most challenging part. And if there's resources, it seems like there's an easy fit. The interesting piece in this case is there was not resources associated with it. There was no big grant that brought everybody together and brought the researchers in and did all this. This was really about people being interested in making a difference in their community, and the event induced that interest. So there was that driver and that catalyst. But there was concern about what was going to happen after the game, so there was quite a bit of uncertainty around that. But because they had built some strong leadership and strong shared leadership, so everybody had a specific role to play within their organization, and they were accountable. When they come to the table at each of the meetings, they're accountable for what they've been doing to drive those goals of the collective forward. So it's a really important piece that they come together. And that there is incentives, and so they've worked together for a very long time with a very strong goal in mind to secure some resources, and they've been very successful at that. One of the things they've struggled with, and I know working with some of the other provinces, and I've done a bit of work with some other provinces, and this is a challenge, is determining the right fit of the players at the table. How do you determine who should be at the table and who might not have that stake or that interest. And so going back to those drivers of why people are interested and why they have that shared motivation is absolutely fundamental. So whenever it comes up of should we invite a new group or a new organization to the table to be involved, the question has to go back to what is the consideration for why they want to be here and what value does that add to the overall goals. And that's probably a very challenging part, because in this community, when we talk about inclusivity, it's probably the one place that you actually want to be a bit exclusive, because you can't have everyone's voice at the table or you will not achieve anything. And that's very clear in the management literature, that if you put too many voices to the table, you will achieve nothing. So you need to make some hard decisions, and those decisions are based on the framework that you've put in place. And so Ontario's still struggling a bit with that. I don't think that we've got that right yet, but certainly that's been a learning. When the games were there was a strong motivation. Post-games, I would say that's probably struggling a little bit. So thinking about the moving forward, one of the things that we learned along the way was the ways in which we communicate and think about the process. And the assumptions that people knew each other was a really important one, and that organizations were already connected. Because if you deliver Parasport, or you have a Parasport program, or you have something related to the disability community, obviously you must be connected, right? Clearly that's not the case. That's why we're here. So the communication to get those partners to be able to speak to one another, but also to build that trust. So now that they can say, I'll pick up the phone, I have that network that I can call and say, I need these things, can you help me out with that? And that's been a big piece of the outcomes of that. So how the communication happens is probably critical. And that knowledge transfer, so the number one thing that's done at the beginning of each of the meetings when we meet face-to-face is partner updates. And it seems like a simple process. And at times it seems like one of those things, and I've sat there and many of my students have been to these meetings and thinking, oh my gosh, we have to listen to this again. And yet it's absolutely critical for the organizations to be able to share the activities they're doing to meet the broader goals of the collective. And without that, I mean, how many emails do you get? Are you going to read through everybody's report? That little 2 minutes that we give everybody at the beginning of each meeting to give those critical partner updates has been fundamental to being able to build that trust and retain that trust among that collective group. However, given the vast amount of knowledge with the number of players at the table, the going forward piece is we're not sure what the best strategy is. How do we, now that we have all this knowledge, we have all these resources, we have all these actions, how do we go to continue communicating that? What is the best strategy? And that's something we're still working on. And we need to think about that as we move forward. And one of the central questions that came up at our meeting on Wednesday was, if we are going to bring in new organizations that want to be part of this, why and how do we communicate effectively the history that we've built together over the 5 years that we've been working on this to ensure that they buy into, they have their own principled engagement strategy, they buy into what the goals of our collective is about, and they are working towards that same principled engagement goal. So that's certainly an ongoing challenge that I don't think anywhere in the partnership literature from organizations has solved any of those challenges yet. So each organization has to figure out, and each collective has to figure out what the best strategy is. So we're still, that one I would say is probably still a big work in progress. I think that probably the biggest thing is there's a shared motivation, but the shared motivation, again, needs to be broader than we want to increase participation in Parasport. That's an easy one to say. There needs to be a motivation around working together with other organizations, because if it's simply a singular goal that we want to do and we all think we're working towards that, we need to pull apart that goal a little bit more clearly. What does that mean for the province? And each of the provinces I've worked with so far, it does look quite different. It looks very different in British Columbia than it is in Ontario. And yet we assume, because we're both big provinces, that it's going to mean the same thing. And in order to do that, the one big thing that I think has come up is that we need to look more clearly at what the pathways for participation are in the province of Ontario. So the big gap. And so that way, we've been able to go back to the partners and talk about their own capabilities to address these specific goals. And then we balance out those priorities. Otherwise, what we found, and this is also very clear in other organizational partnership literature, is partners are going after what they think is the goal in their own way, and that's not achieving the collective action that's necessary. So clarifying that on an ongoing basis is absolutely critical. And so what I'll leave you with is sort of thinking about some of the challenges. Moving forward, we have yet to set forth a clear formalization process. So setting a clear, formalized system of engagement and a structure for that organization. It's time. After 5 years of working together, a partnership does need some level of system and structure. And so it was nice to work with the group again this week to see that they were moving towards that governance framework. And that has to be explicit around that shared theory of action. So this is what we're trying to achieve. This is the breakdown of those goals, and this is how we move that particular agenda forward. So making sure that all those voices are at the table, and part of that conversation is critical, but also thinking about how do we move the agenda forward. So the key piece, I think, is we've heard it today, is that we all have that shared motivation, and the values piece is absolutely critical, but those need to be communicated clearly, shared, and there has to be a good catalyst that bring the partners to the table. Because if you don't have the catalyst, the chances are that you're going to have a really interested group of people that will fade away after that catalyst is, if there's not a good catalyst. So to be very clear about that. Have someone like us. I think the big great thing that Andrea and I have been very fortunate with our provinces and working with is that they've actually asked us as researchers, as critical scholars, to come to the table, to ask the hard questions, and to get them to challenge some of the assumptions they have about what they've been doing. And maybe think a little bit differently so they can be a bit more innovative. And draw on the lessons from others. You know, you've got 2 provinces here who have done very different things. It's no good in this country to start working in isolation. So come and talk to us more about how things have happened and how we've sustained those over the long term so that we can learn those lessons from each other and tailor accordingly for the appropriate ways of engaging. And the fundamental piece that everything we go back to is that principal engagement piece. So why are partners there? What do they get out of it? What does the collective get out of it? And how is that getting us forward to meet our goals? And so I think that's been a really big piece that we keep coming back to, and that's why we've been able to sustain that collective even now 2.5 years post-games, which is something that's really unheard of in the event space. And I've been studying events for 15 years. This is a really unique case. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Laura. Last but by no means least, Jen from CPC will be talking about activities going on largely in other provinces other than Ontario and British Columbia.
Do you want to pull up my slide as well? I have a few slides to share too. But I'll start by saying, so I have kind of the task of pulling some of this together. So CPC has been obviously pretty involved in Ontario, and so I will try not to repeat what Laura just said. We've also worked in some of the other provinces as well, and this is something that's kind of emerging for us as an organization. So I'll start with a little bit of a kind of backgrounder on CPC. I think for some of you who maybe have been involved in Parasport, in Canada for a long time, you may have over the last couple of years started to see a shift in our organization. We were once everything to everyone, I think. Anything attached to disability, CPC was there. And we have slowly started to begin that refinement of our strategy and what we do in this country. So there's some graphics up here on the screen. To your right, my left, there's a map of Canada with a maple leaf and a kind of globe coming out of it. And that kind of connects into your top left, a young girl who looks like she's just exerted herself completing a run, bent over, out of breath. And her coach right there looks like he's giving her some instruction. She has a prosthetic on, and there's a caption across that says Paralympic Pathways. And that kind of leads into another image of a young girl with a running blade on, competing at the Paralympic Games. This is the same girl. This is Marissa, one of our up-and-coming Paralympic athletes. And that second picture there is her competing in Rio with a caption across that says, Road to the Podium. And so that is kind of a Paralympic pathway for us. Our vision as the Canadian Paralympic Committee is to become a world-leading nation by 2022, and so that's where our strategy is currently driving us towards. And our mission, so the what we do, is we lead the development of a sustainable Paralympic sports system in Canada to enable athletes to reach the podium at the Paralympic Games. And for me, that's a pretty jam-packed mission and could mean a lot of different things. But for me, the kind of key piece is that systems piece. For us, ultimately, we want to see performances and success at the Paralympic Games. And part of what we do to achieve that is we deliver Team Canada to the Games. So a lot of the work that we do in preparing Team Canada to get to the Games and to be able to perform at the Games is a piece of what we do. But to ignore everything else below that at this stage would not be sustainable and would not lead to that kind of systemic approach. And so the next few slides that I'm going to talk about, this is some framing that CPC has used, but I think some of the things that we talk about here are actually transferable across other organizations. So our stakeholder list, so these are the organizations that we work with. We're a member-driven organization. We have 25 sport members. Those are our national sport organizations. They're the ones that are kind of driving the sport in the country, but they're not the only ones that we work with. We work with governments, federal government, Sport Canada. We have performance partners, so Own the Podium, Coaches Association of Canada, CIRC, the COPS and networks. We also work with the provinces, so Alberta, Ontario, BC. We also have our athletes, our coaches, officials, our alumni, universities, researchers like my two colleagues here. And the list kind of goes on. And so for us, yes, our members are NSOs, but for us to be able to have that systemic impact that we're after to lead to that sustainability, we need to think a little bit broader than just our members. And then we also spend a lot of time thinking about kind of where we can play the best roles in terms of leading that system. Quite a few years ago, a lot of our work was very much on the ground, delivering programming. We were in communities delivering programming. But that's shifted. We've put more attention on how we facilitate relationships between partners, whether that's national partners, provincial partners, and some of those bridging aspects. How do we provide the best financial enhancements that can make the biggest difference? How do we share para-expertise? So not only expertise within sport, but also information that's kind of evidence-informed and data-driven. How do we promote all the other good things that are going on within our system to be able to kind of share that knowledge and promote across the country? And how do we leverage some of the important sectors that we work within to kind of achieve that sustainability? And then again, this is kind of the last one that's listed is execute on internal excellence. That's more for us in terms of really trying to stay targeted and focused on kind of where we can play the best role. So that's just a little bit about CPC. I'm going to talk a little bit about some context pieces, and Laura's actually covered a lot of it quite nicely already. But I think maybe my point here is actually it's scalable. It could be big, but it could also be small. So some of the examples that Laura gave in terms of major games or policy or that political climate. So yes, there's Para-Pan Am Games or the Paralympic Games that are massive opportunities. But there's also smaller opportunities, community events that can provide that catalyst. There's provincial legislation, there's organizational policy, there's also national policy and legislation. So it's scalable. And so for us, when we do this kind of work, systems work, we try to think broadly about that it doesn't necessarily have to be one big thing. We also talk about readiness a lot. So there's catalysts, there's drivers, but there's also readiness. And readiness shifts and changes over time. There's organizational readiness. Just because an organization isn't ready today doesn't mean that they're not going to be ready in a year from now or 2 years from now. And so we try to pay a lot of attention to who's ready, who's there at the table, how can we leverage what's currently happening from an asset-based approach and kind of use that to drive it forward, not discounting those who are not ready, but being able to have that impact that we want, and also kind of keeping an eye to the full landscape. And then the national landscape as well, when we kind of think about what's happening at the provincial level, what's also happening at the national level. And I think there's kind of a lot of lessons there in terms of readiness too. What's that readiness at the national level? What's that readiness at the provincial level? And how do we bridge that? So those are some kind of contextual pieces that we think about. And the other kind of context piece that I wanted to talk about, and then again, this might be a bit repetitive, but as I was building these slides, I tried to take a step back because I think sometimes, well, language shapes our world, and I think sometimes we kind of use language with a little bit of privilege, assuming that everyone has the same understanding of what it means. And I think in sport, two words that we often hear is this concept of a pathway and this concept of a system. We've heard it a lot today. And so when I was thinking about this, I tried to take a step back and say, okay, what does Webster's dictionary define as a pathway and as a system, as a way to maybe just take a step back and say, is this actually, do we all mean the same thing? And so what the Google said was a pathway, a way that constitutes or serves a path, or a way of achieving a specified result or a course of action. For that, some of those kind of bolded words, serves a path, specified result, rang true. And I have a little bit of a diagram, also from Google, up on the screen, of a pathway. And so for us, a pathway, and David alluded to it this morning, it's a journey. And I think the journey is specific to the individual. And a journey for each individual, has different points where they stop or start again or stop. They also cross other journeys. They also have different destinations. One destination could be the Paralympic Games, but that's not necessarily the same thing for everyone. And so I think that's important for kind of us as organizations to think about, because each organization has a role to play in helping build that pathway so that every individual can go on their journey. And the tricky part is kind of figuring out what your best role is to play to support that journey. And that kind of leads into the systems piece. So what's a system? A system is a regularly interacting or interdependent group of items forming a unified whole. So for me, the things that popped out were regularly interacting, interdependent, and unified whole. A set of connected things or parts forming a complex whole. And to the right, I also have another Google image of a bunch of individuals in a circle with lines connecting them. Some individuals, or in this case could be organizations, connect to just one other, but other times they connect to multiple others. I think this is probably a pretty good depiction of how our sports system in Canada works. We have a number of different organizations who are all working, and I think what's happened over the years is as we have sought to seek out, to get understanding of how we make the biggest impact, we've parceled things out and maybe lost sight of that unified whole and how each individual organization can kind of contribute to that. And that sounds very lofty, and obviously, as Laura spoke about, it's not that easy, and I'll give some examples. But for me, I wanted to kind of take a step back and digest that a little bit, because that's something that we think about a lot. So I'm going to talk a little bit about pathways and system, and I'm going to talk to them a little bit in the framing of what's happening in the provinces. So like I said, pathway development. So what are those pieces that can support an athlete on their journey? This is a list here. It's by no means the list, but it's just some examples of things that we think about. So when we think about a pathway, grassroots and community participation is for sure a piece of that. Everyone has to have their place to start. We know in Parasport that starting point is not the same for everyone. It's different. It happens at different times, different stages. There's different levels of readiness for each individual. So it's really important for us to understand that quality piece of how do we, at every single stage or everything that we do, provide that quality. We also talk a lot about athlete recruitment and ID. This is an area that is on the radars quite a bit for our national sport organizations of how do we get more people involved, how do we get more athletes involved in the system. And I'm going to speak a little bit to this more in depthly because the provinces are approaching this a little bit differently, so I won't go into too much now. We also look at coaching. So how do we have coaches better equipped to support our athletes, our para-athletes, as they move through the system. Classification, that's a big one. What does classification look at the provincial level? Classification is sport-specific, but it also happens at different times. And so how do we understand what that means for each sport, and how do we kind of build in those structures to be able to best support athletes when the time is right for them to be classified so that they can then excel along their Paralympic journey. And then performance pathway. So when you get into those stages of high performance, there's additional things that we kind of think about: sports science, sport medicine. What are those specifics that we can do to help an athlete excel at the world stage? So I'm going to go through a little bit about some lessons learned. We've been working in the provinces in some of these kind of pathway areas. So athlete recruitment and ID. CPC currently runs an initiative called the Paralympian Search. It's an athlete ID and recruitment initiative. We work with our member NSOs on it, and more recently, some of the other members of the community PSOs, community organizations. One of the things that we've learned, and I think Laura just alluded to it as well, is that local and community context. I think in the past, we made the mistake of just plopping ourselves into a province and a city, running this event, and then saying, oh, okay, so we're going to get more athletes in the system now. It didn't really work that way. But so now what we're paying attention to, we're really pushing our NSOs and people that are coming out to this event to do is to plan and to think about, if you're there to help support an athlete to get into your sport, what's your next step? What's going to be their first touch point? How are they going to have a positive first experience? And it's contextual and it's local as well. We were just in Victoria this past weekend, and canoe kayak was there, and there was a couple of athletes that looked like they had a lot of potential to excel in canoe. And one of the individuals that was there lives in a bit more of a remote area of BC. And in speaking with our contact at Canoe Kayak, he said, I'd love for her to get involved in the sport if she's interested, but we just don't have any clubs in that area for her to join. And so that conversation is, okay, maybe, of course, give her the information, let her know that that's an option, but for her to actually get involved and kind of pursue this sport, that local context may not be there at this time for her to do that sport. And so that's something that we're really pushing our NSOs to think about as they kind of go down this path of athlete recruitment. And it's also addressed differently across the provinces. So I'll give an example in Quebec. Quebec has identified that athlete development is an area that they're really interested in focusing on and developing, and so within that, athlete recruitment comes into place. And so they've really taken on a leadership role within this Paralympian Search event and other kind of athlete recruitment initiatives. And this goes back to that concept of, again, organizational readiness and those catalysts. So we had the Quebec government that was there and ready and wanted to engage. So, okay, how can we take that readiness and use it to leverage kind of some work in this area for the province? And so in next weekend, they'll have a number of their PSOs out, and so we're working to try and kind of bridge that and provide a good opportunity. Classification is a tricky one. Again, I said it's sport specific, and it looks different in each province. Right now, classification is currently being driven at the national level. A lot of our NSOs are literally doing everything there is to do with classification at the international level, at the domestic level, and anything else that trickles beneath it. And what we're exploring with Ontario right now is how can the provincial level actually support that? And we haven't figured out the answer yet, but it's a question that we're asking and again, when we think about systems, I think there's a way that each organization could potentially have a role to support, not every organization, but there are maybe organizations out there that could support the overall goal. So yes, classification is set internationally, it's set by the sport, but how can other organizations help support that? So when we figure it out, I'll let you guys know. The other side of things, so system development, and I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but again, pathways and systems, they're linked, they're not separate. You need both to have a sustainable kind of sports system here in Canada. And so some of the foundations, and again, this builds off of what Laura was saying, what are some of those foundational pieces that we need to have a sustainable system? So partnerships and collaboration, understanding the stakeholders and what their contributions are, and this is a lot of the examples that we take from the work that we're doing in Ontario. Policy, how can we embed inclusive policies to support organizations to deliver? And again, policy can go on a continuum of, yes, policy at the government level, but also policy within organizations, within communities, within municipalities, and how do those all connect to make sure that we are providing inclusive opportunities and spaces. Funding is another big one. It's obviously also linked to policy, and what we've learned from Ontario is, it has to make sense for Parasport. So previously in Ontario, their funding structures were driven by the able-bodied model, and so they were driven by numbers. And so organizations were funded based on how many numbers of participants, athletes they had in their sport. And for our parasport organizations, that was very problematic, especially those that were running multiple sports. And so through process of working with the government, we've slowly started to shift that. And it's still a work in progress as well for them. We also think about structure and alignment. Structure is an interesting thing and learning a lot about it. And structure looks different in each province. I'll give a few examples of that in a little bit too. We have the role, what are roles, role clarity, those are things that we talk about a lot. We have DSOs, PSOs, you have MSOs, you have all these different organizations that are doing different things, and how do we kind of build a system where we're all working in harmony. And then the final thing is knowledge mobilization, so enhancing the experience or the expertise and knowledge within the system, and again, there's a research component to that as well. So I won't talk about too much about Ontario, but really what we're after is trying to reshape our assumptions of how we work together. We're still in a work in progress. It's still evolving, and it's interesting because one of the other provinces approached us the other day. So the Ontario Parasport Collective was lucky enough to secure $2.4 million in funding from the Ontario Trillium Foundation for the next 5 years, which is quite massive. And the response was, oh my gosh, that's great. How can we get something like that? That seems like the answer to solve our problems. And the response was, this took 5+ years to get here. And it's really been grounded in that partnerships and collaboration piece. Structure and alignment. So this is where I'm going to give some examples of some of the other provinces, and it looks different in each province. So we have provinces out east who are quite small and geographically small as well. You have multi-sport organizations, so your Parasport NL, Newfoundland, or your Parasport and Rec PEI, who are multi-sport organizations who are doing everything from being hands-on, working with programs, also helping work with some of the PSOs. You have Sport Nova Scotia out in Nova Scotia who has a Parasport staff embedded within their structure who is working with PSOs and DSOs to support them. And so it looks different. In Ontario, there's an organization called Parasport Ontario, and I'm going to talk about transitions in a little bit too, who has seen a lot of transition. And I think when we talk about systems, it's important to think about that systems aren't stagnant. And so these organizations out east, there is a need right now for those multi-sport organizations to provide that support. They're working directly with PSOs to help build their own Parasport programming, but that's going to shift over time as each organization perhaps becomes more sophisticated. And so what does that look like for the other Parasport organization, the Parasport NLs and the Parasport Nova Scotias? And this is what's happened in Ontario, is there was formerly a body that was doing some of that work, but that need may not be there anymore. And so what does that look like for that organization now? And the collective has kind of stepped in and still doing that work. And I think sometimes we also forget that there's nothing wrong with transitions, there's nothing wrong with change, and there's also nothing wrong with a life cycle, which is something hard to wrap your head around. But I think kind of the point I want to make around structure is it's not stagnant, it changes, and it's uncomfortable, but I think it's something that we kind of need to try and wrap our heads around when we try to make this big change, and we try to do this work of aligning our system to kind of have that greater impact. And so finally, I'm just kind of give some kind of overall considerations, again, of how we've kind of approached things. Grounded in a needs-based approach is something that we've considered. Each province, we've noticed, has the things that are important to them. So Nova Scotia, in some early conversations, said, coaching. This is an area that we think that we can have an impact on. This is an area that we see a gap in. So how can we work on coaching? We said, okay, great, go. BC is doing some work around funding and looking at that alignment between PSOs and how we fund them. So funding is a piece. So each province has their kind of own needs and gaps and areas. So our approach has been, how do we take what those needs are and recognize maybe what their current assets are, and that kind of brings me into that next point of recognizing and building upon assets. So how do we take those assets and build upon them, and kind of move things forward from there? Change doesn't happen overnight. We kind of try to start small. Intentionality of what we do. How do we understand kind of what our North Star goal is, and how do we be intentional about it to build our strategy? I think Ontario's done some really good work in terms of articulating what that North Star is. They've built it from what the government had said was some priorities, and they've morphed it into something that people can kind of get themselves behind. But it's a work in progress. And then the next point is alignment and leveraging the work of all the parties interested, and that's kind of been a theme throughout. An effective use of resources. I think that effectiveness in our resources comes easier when we start to work together a little bit more. So I think that was kind of it in terms of some of my comments, and I'll open it up for questions, I suppose.
Thank
Or
you
back
very
to
much.
David, rather.
Three exciting, thank you for the Canadian perspective, overall Canadian perspective. Three very, very interesting and diverse but connected presentations. And the floor is now open for about 20 minutes for questions. Any questions? Well, I'm going to take Chair's prerogative. Sorry, no, go on. No, please, there's a question over here.
This question is for Andrea. I was really interested in your different categories of organizations and how they fit into each category. And you said you have rolled that out already or approached organizations about kind of that model?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that last bit?
Have you rolled it out? Like, have you told organizations or like?
We're in process, I guess. All the PSOs and DSOs in the province, they're very aware that the investment review is happening this year. They know that one of the areas that they will expect to see change is in, like I said, the last investment review had some very general questions around disability and parasport. They know that's changing. They know it's going to be more specific, and one of the things they've been told is it's going to try to tailor those questions more to the specific roles of the organizations. Where we've started to share that actual list that I had up on the screen has been in these interviews where, like I said, we're in the organizations right now interviewing them, and it's not, we're very clear, this is not evaluating them. This is not, your funding's not going to be taken away based on how you answer these questions. We're trying to refine this model. And in fact, in this year's investment review, don't worry too much about this. We're viewing this year's investment review very much as like testing out whether or not this is an appropriate way to be evaluating. So they're definitely, not all of them have perhaps engaged with it to the same extent, but by the end of the year, all of them will have seen this.
What's the feedback? Like, do people like to know where they fit within, like, it almost seems like a spectrum or like a,
yeah.
do people like that or not really?
What I showed on the screen is a very abbreviated, and that the woman I'm working with, my co-investigator on this in Viasport, Caitlin Panafilla, her brain works in a very different way in visualizing connections, and she has a spreadsheet and a schematic, and she can kind of pull in different things so that people see their role perhaps in policy, their role in advocacy, their role in delivering program, and it takes them through a bit of a process to go, is this accurate? Is this what you actually do? And yeah, like I said, I don't think we've got every organization classified correctly or finally, and we don't, it's in progress. But there has been, I think, in general, a good response in this is a useful exercise to engage in, because organizations feel like either they're not getting the funding to do what they think they could be doing, or they're actually not sure what their role is. So we had an incident, early in the year where an athlete wasn't carded because the assumption was she was being supported by BC Wheelchair Athletics, BC Wheelchair Sport. So why would BC Athletics card her? give her funding, right? So they know that this lack of clarity is causing problems, and they're, I think, generally positive to trying to have more clarity around that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, I will take chair's prerogative, and I wanted to tie these things together. So this question is for all three of you. One of the things that Andrea highlighted was this idea of championing positive change. And one of the points that Jen finished on was this idea that the programs are needs-based and not rights-based. And I wondered if there's not a tension there between this notion of needs versus the notion of rights, like human rights and that sort of thing. I wondered if you could comment on that.
I'm the one.
No, any of you.
Yeah, I think there is. It's kind of interesting. I mean, I guess it's easy to kind of blanketly say, yes, there's a need, and maybe not think too much beneath that, and maybe also not understanding the kind of current landscape, and so what one person or one set of people or organizations maybe think is a need could actually potentially be very biased, and then that's maybe where you kind of get that tension around what's that right. So yeah, it's a good point. So how do we kind of balance that? I guess would be a challenging thing of kind of breaking down some of those assumptions kind of that we hold that create that bias of what we think is a need. Probably also ties into the gaps. We use gaps a lot, which I would maybe associate closely with needs. In sport, I think we tend to think there's so many gaps. We talk about gaps a lot, but it doesn't. I find it sometimes closes down the conversation and that opportunity for us to maybe have a bit more of an open dialogue about how we can actually lead to some of that change.
I would say there's a tension, but I think one of the things that we're trying to think more and be intentional about those gaps is what do those organizations need or could help in order to achieve those gaps, which I think is filling some of that rights approach. So you should have these things should be in place, but clearly there are some gaps. So what can we do, what needs to be in place in order to support and fill some of those gaps in the system? And one of the things in Ontario that we're doing right now is looking at where there are gaps in that pathway with certain sports, and determining, okay, well, what should be in place to ensure that there is the appropriate access within that pathway. And in order to have that right, there needs to be filling of those gaps somehow. And so those might be resources, those might be, they're all different types of capital. And many times it's just, I just need to know the person that I call. And that's an important resource to have. So that's, I think those are important parts of it. So I wouldn't say there's not much attention. I think it's working together within the context of understanding what those are and what their organizations could have in order to make it a better, more aligned system and a more aligned pathway.
And I mean, I think it's an interesting question, like what Laura said about trying to figure out, okay, what do you actually need to be able to fulfill or to address those gaps? That's been part of our approach too, but I think we have gone a slightly different direction, taking a little bit more of a rights-based approach, and especially in that sort of that community engagement piece where it's been really liberating for me as I've been involved in the programs that many of you are involved in, where I've had to tell people, like, I'm sorry, we actually don't have the funding for you, or we don't have this program isn't for you. And because my funding is tied to a very, very narrow and specific population. So it's been really liberating for me to be able to actually go in, like I said, that open house, and like, people are coming in with, sometimes it's complex disability, sometimes it's coming in with, they came with their own ideas of what was needed, and I actually can say, like, yeah, we're interested in hearing about that, because it's all under that Level the Field campaign. And even if that doesn't mean, I might not have the answer, I might not be able, but we try to take the approach that we can't turn anyone away, that we're going to try to connect them with something, someone. We're going to follow up on everyone, with everyone who speaks with us, and I think just going at it from that other angle has created some different opportunities for us.
I think the other thing it connects to what's happening in BC. Is in Ontario, the funders are at the table in our collective. Like, they're not separate and distinct. We're not working for that. They're sitting at the table with us, having those conversations with us, which has been probably a big strength of that collective. They've been able to shape and reframe policy so that the questions that are asked on grants and the grant review process is not been around those types of exclusive frameworks. It's so what are the things that we should be looking at, and what things should go into those requests for those grant applications, and then the review and the final reports process. And that's been very, very helpful for them to be able to think about those things in different and new ways that is a lot less exclusive in terms of the way that they typically would do those things. Yeah.
Been critical.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Somebody must have a burning question. Yes.
You lovely dropped the word intersectionality, and I'd just love to know how that plays out. 'Cause I think we've been talking a lot about what happens for like folks who are sort of marginalized, doubly marginalized or more, and how in your work that plays out in terms like what's being changed in terms of intersectionality, I guess, in BC.
It's early. I think what's being achieved is some interesting conversations. And like Laura said, sort of having the funders at the table has been like, I think it's been eye-opening to find out that, you know, we've invested a lot in sport over the years, and yet we are reaching so narrow of a group. What we're actually going to be able to, that's still pretty, and that's, I mean, that we're learning more, but that action piece is still, on some levels, it's having, like I can tell you at the UNA, at the community center this fall, there will be programs there that will be open to more diverse people. Like, we're in the process of figuring out exactly what that will be, and that will include both trying to, supporting people to access existing programs, but also creating some new programs that are going to be far more consider intersectional and be just generally a little more open. But what that's going to look like on sort of like BC sport policy level, not too, yeah. We're still a ways away from that.
I would say in Ontario, it has a lot more to do with the relationships, the social capital between those partners around the table that are not even around the table, that when their questions come up about access, and maybe it's not to my program, but I know who and then where we can go to sort out and challenge this so that there are those opportunities created. So interestingly, as you present, and I haven't seen the BC piece in a while, the one thing we heard from the organizations when we interviewed all those is, I don't want to be labeled. Don't label us, because if you label my organization and what we're about, then it doesn't give us the opportunity to create new opportunities for others to participate. So it's an interesting juxtaposition, because in one hand, the funders are looking for some sort of framework to put you in a particular box. And actually, those organizations are saying, whoa, no, actually, if you want us to be able to offer all these kinds of programs and opportunities for various groups, then don't label. And so and that's a tension that's still an ongoing piece that I'm not sure how to figure that out.
One thing that I can maybe give is sort of an example of where we might look is, we have actually, I come from a critical disabilities perspective, but we're actually drawing, I think, on queer theory and crip theories as well, because we're looking at some sports that have taken really interesting approaches to gender inclusion as well, and sort of this queering of sport spaces, and going, what could we learn from this, and what might it mean to like queer the sports sector more broadly? And so that's where I say that some of the level of the field, like, they're individual initiatives, but we do try to share learnings across. And there are some sports that have done really creative things around gender inclusion. So could we learn from that to do disability inclusion? We'll see. Pardon? Well, examples of that. I mean, in the earlier panel, you're talking about like some sports just, they don't have policies around trans inclusion. And actually other sports have been really leading in this area and have, I won't say no problems in integrating and including trans people, but they're doing some good work. And when you think about that, like, okay, well, what could Parasport is still really so stuck up on the classification. What's your classification? What's your classification? And well, actually, here are sports that have actually moved away from like, how do you create good competitive opportunities regardless of classifying gender? So, yeah, that small examples, but trying to share that.
I think a lot of it kind of just starts with a conversation. I mean, yeah, I don't think anyone has figured it out, but like to Laura's point, starting with a conversation and sharing of how we can kind of find those opportunities. I'll pull some examples from Ontario, but when we kind of think about women and girls' involvement in sport and then intersectionality between women and girls and disability, those are pieces that are being looked at with the Coaches Association of Ontario right now, and some of the work that they're doing coaching with mentorship. And so those are small steps kind of towards looking at a broader perspective in terms of inclusion. And a lot of it just started from that conversation and that connection. And again, it takes time, right? So, how do we move the dial the next time to the bigger conversation? That next step is kind of the key piece.
And ironically, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, Jen, but at our meeting on Wednesday, one of the main topics that came up was the name of the collective.
Yep.
Because currently it's the Ontario Parasport Collective, but many of the associations around the table have now connected on how do we be more inclusive of, LGBTQ, trans, et cetera, and have made those connections and are working together on sorting out what they feel the best approach is. So the group has started to question whether we should change that mandate a bit. And so I think that's a positive step to thinking about inclusion and that rights approach in a different way for these organizations that probably 5 years ago would not have had that conversation, or anyone to reach out to say, what do we do? How do we think about this? So.
Any other questions? I know you must be smelling the pizza from behind the curtain. So thank you very much to all our presenters for this session, and enjoy your dinner.